Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Yes, that's better. Welcome here at this wonderful opportunity, this public lecture with the Governor of the South African Reserve Bank. I would like to welcome the following people. First of all, Mr. Governor, yourself, Mr. Lesetja Kganyago. Then secondly, the Acting Rector and Vice Rector, Institutional Change, Student Affairs and Community Engagement, Professor Puleng Lenkabula. Thirdly, the Vice Rector Academic, Dr. Engela van Staden. The Dean of the Economic and Management Sciences Faculty, Professor Henry Krokamp. The Dean of Natural and Agricultural Sciences, Professor Dani Vermeulen. The Director of Communications and Marketing, Mrs. Lasha Lauder, and the SRC President, Katlego Lechuo. Lesetja Kganyago was recently reappointed as the Governor of the South African Reserve Bank for a second term. His first term effective from November 2014. He had been the Deputy Governor of the South African Reserve Bank since May 2011. In this role, he was responsible for a wide range of areas, including research, financial stability, bank supervision, financial regulation, reform, including the Twin Peaks regulatory structure, financial surveillance, including taking responsibility for the regulation of cross-border flows, risk management and compliance, and the functions of the South African Reserve Bank Academy. For those of you interested in the cadet program, that's the Reserve Bank's Academy. Now, Governor Kganyago has more than 20 years of experience in formulating and implementing public policy, having spent this time at the Central Bank and at the National Treasury. During his time at the National Treasury, a fundamental reform in the management of national debt portfolio was completed, and he successfully steered several public finance and financial market reforms. Governor Kganyago has led the South African technical team in various G20 Ministers of Finance and Central Bank Governor meetings and summits, including the inaugural summit in 2008. He has chaired the IMF World Bank Development Committee Deputies and the G20 Working Group on IMF Governance Reform. He also has been the Vice Chair of the Financial Stability Board Standing Committee on Standards Implementation for 4 years. Currently, Governor Kganyago chairs the Committee of Central Bank Governors of the Southern African Development Community and co-chairs the Financial Stability Board's Regional Consultative Group for Sub-Saharan Africa. He also chairs the Financial Stability Board's Standing Committee on Standards Implementation. He was appointed as the International Monetary and Financial Committee Chairman, effective from the 18th of January 2018, for a period of 3 years. The International Monetary and Financial Committee is the primary advisory body of the IMF Board of Governors and deliberates on the principal policy issues facing the IMF. Governor Kganyago holds a Master's of Science degree in Development Economics from the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies and a Bachelor of Commerce degree in Accounting and Economics from the University of South Africa. Now, ladies and gentlemen, roughly a year ago, we attended the Minister Mbowene's colloquia on how to kickstart the South African economy's growth rate. We had a number of international economists there, but one of the best presentations was that by Governor Kganyago. He did not mince words about what is wrong with the economy and, more importantly, what should be done to rectify the problems and get economic growth in the country going again. At that presentation, I thought it would be great if his views on this important question reaches a wider audience. So, when the opportunity came up to get the Governor here, I thought, let's go for it. Let's bring him to our students. And here he is, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Governor, welcome. We eagerly look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Prof, and for those introductions. And also, thank you very much for dealing with the protocols so that I do not have to go through those protocols again. And thank you very much for inviting me here today to speak about the South African economy. It's always better speaking at the university because you do not have to worry about where you pitch your speech. You just talk economics because you are talking to economists, and in most public fora, one struggles, where do I pitch this? If it's business people or it's high school learners and so forth, it becomes difficult. So always nice to be speaking at a university. Tonight I'm going to focus on how we should use macroeconomic policy and its role in our economic growth problem. There is a principle in economics known as the Don Bush rule, that a crisis takes long to happen than you expect, but then occurs faster than you can believe. It is the macroeconomic version of the old rule about how you go bankrupt slowly, then very quickly. The point is that you get a lot of bad data before the system breaks. Experts will warn about a crisis, and after a while, these warnings will become part of the background noise. But when the crisis comes, its timing will still surprise everyone. In South Africa, we are getting used to talking about a crisis. Every time the Minister of Finance presents a new budget or medium-term budget policy statement to Parliament, the press calls it a make or break event, or the most important budget since the dawn of democracy. I have been answering questions about Moody's downgrade for years. We are even discussing distant possibilities like an IMF program as if they were imminent. Actually, while our debt to GDP ratio has more than doubled over 10 years, it is still in the region of the emerging market average, which is 55%. Our debt has a long maturity profile and is denominated mostly in rands, which diminishes the risk of losing market access and being forced to ask the IMF for help. The debt problem is not where we are. The problem is where we are going. There is an old joke of a man who falls from the top of a tall building. Halfway down, he passes someone on a balcony who asks, "How is it going?" And the man answers, "So far, so good." We are like that man. A debt to GDP ratio of 60% is not a disaster. But our fiscal deficits are over 6% of GDP, and the National Treasury expects a deficit of nearly 7% of GDP for the 2020-2021 fiscal year. At that rate of borrowing, it doesn't take long to get to a dangerous level of debt. Some analysts suggest we could get to a 100% debt to GDP ratio within a few years. In that scenario, lenders might give up on us, or we could see our interest bill claim even more of our scarce resources. But we haven't locked in that path yet. We are suffering the consequences of past mistakes, but we still have time to make better decisions. It's crucial we use this time wisely. In economic terms, our problems can be addressed, but there is a real danger of getting our narrative wrong. So we end up having the wrong discussion. We don't solve our problems, and we learn our mistake the hard way by having a crisis. This talk is my contribution to prevent that by getting the narrative right. Let's start with the macroeconomic stance. I only have responsibility for one part of the macro mix, which is monetary policy. But the Constitution enjoins the Reserve Bank to consult regularly with the Minister of Finance so that fiscal and monetary policies are in sync. It's therefore important that we understand that what fiscal policy is doing and how it interacts with monetary policy. Accordingly, we as the South African Reserve Bank have invested considerable time and effort in this task. By our calculations, the fiscal impulse to growth was around 0.6% last year. This estimate excludes bailout for state-owned enterprises as well as interest payments. A positive fiscal impulse shows that policy is not austere, and yet overall growth was just 0.2%, suggesting that the economy experienced a contractionary fiscal expansion despite the fiscal impulse. The growth rate of the economy slowed. This combination of looser fiscal policy and worse growth points to fiscal side effects that cancelled out the fiscal impulse, leaving the economy poorer overall. What are these indirect effects? One is confidence. We can see in surveys that both households and business confidence is near long-term lows at the moment. People have seen taxes go up, they see debt rising, but they do not see this spending producing better services. It is a discouraging picture. Businesses are still investing, but they are not ramping up production. Households are holding off on major purchases. There is also evidence more highly skilled people are leaving the country. The second indirect effect is through long-term interest rates. As you know, we at the South African Reserve Bank had reduced the repo rate lately with cuts in July 2019 and January 2020. We have also tried to steer inflation expectations lower towards the middle of our target range, and we have seen results with all measures of inflation expectations declining. Both these changes would normally have shifted long-term interest rates lower. As financial analysts would say, they should have lowered the whole yield curve. Unfortunately, the yield curve has actually steepened. The gap between short-term and long-term rates is now the widest on record. This is the result of country risk. It is the markets sending a message that there is too much borrowing. It is not about tight monetary policy. As I have explained, lower short rates and lower inflation expectations, which are the main channels between monetary policy and long-term rates, have both been working to reduce rates. Indeed, if it weren't for these factors, the long-term rate would likely be around 100 to 200 basis points higher than it is now, making our interest costs even more burdensome. As it is, interest costs are reducing the real money available for government to spend, reducing the real value of budgets. And these costs have also doubled in the past 5 years to nearly 5% of GDP. Furthermore, a higher risk premium has spread through the rest of the economy, disincentivizing investment by raising the cost of capital. Simply put, our fiscal situation is not a problem of austerity. It isn't about tight monetary policy. It isn't because growth just mysteriously slowed down. Weak growth is endogenous in our fiscal problems. We cannot keep doing what we are doing and just hope that growth will recover and save us. Growth is low, in large part because of unsustainable policies. My friend, the Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, is a man who says things that are true even when they are unpopular. His message is that we have to reduce spending, and he is right to put this at the center of our macroeconomic debate. We can all shout at him and resist his proposals, and in the end, he will at least have the satisfaction of being proved right, or we can follow his advice, solve this problem, and avoid a crisis. Now, let me turn to my core responsibility, which is monetary policy. Once again, I'd like to start with a major misunderstanding, one which plagued us for many years. It is deeply seated belief that there is a trade-off between growth and inflation. This conviction has exposed us to something economists call stagflation. In other words, economic stagnation, which is low growth, and high inflation happening at the same time. At the SARB, we have often had to fight against the tide of opinions which says, let's cut interest rates, we need more growth. So let's just tolerate more inflation. The tragedy is that this instinct has left us looking in the wrong direction. In fact, there is a better space, one that many countries have reached, where inflation is low, where interest rates are therefore lower, and where central banks can be more sensitive to growth precisely because inflation is better anchored. In this space, you don't need to choose between growth and inflation. You can have growth without high inflation. Over the past few years, we at the SARB have undertaken a major strategic initiative to get closer to this good space. Our starting point was stagflation. In 2019, growth had slowed to 0.4%, but we also had inflation outside of our target range above 6%, and core inflation was nearly 6%, having trended steadily higher over the preceding 5 years, even as the economy decelerated. To return inflation to target, we had raised rates to a peak of 7% in 2016. Then as inflation began moderating, we were patient and we communicated that we would prefer to see inflation stabilize around the middle of the target range. Inflation has since largely cooperated. Over the past 3 years, it had averaged 4.6%. Progress has been somewhat more rapid than we had expected, in part due to lower food prices and an exchange rate recovery which helped to bring down underlying inflation. That has created extra space to lower the repo rate. With the January MPC cut, the repo rate is now down to 6.25%, its lowest since 2015. The key point is, we are now in a space where we have got inflation lower, and we have been able to cut rates without sacrificing our credibility. This is how monetary policy is meant to work. You cut rates from a position of strength, not because you have inflation under control, not out of weakness. You cut rates because you have inflation under control, not out of weakness. Because you have given up trying to keep inflation under control. Well, that's the good news. The bad news is that monetary policy alone cannot turn this economy around. As yesterday's GDP figures reminded us, the supply side of this economy is in deep trouble. We experienced a technical recession in the second half of the year, and growth for 2019 as a whole was just 0.2%, the worst rate since the global financial crisis. Analysts have focused on electricity shortages as an important contributor to these bad outcomes with good reason. Unfortunately, these kinds of growth constraints are beyond the reach of monetary policy. The scope for monetary policy is also limited by the fact that inflation has stayed relatively high. In South Africa, we tend to think that inflation has collapsed when it's below 4.5%. But in much of the rest of the world, this is not considered low inflation. The median emerging market had inflation at 2.9% last year, compared to our 4.1%. Brazil, a country much like South Africa, but with a history of significantly higher inflation, was at 3.8%. Advanced economies were lower still. The United States, for example, was at 1.5% in 2019. If South African inflation were to moderate further, we would have much more space to lower interest rates. But even in extremely low growth, inflation does not appear to be slowing further, and we see almost no risk of inflation missing our target from below, which has been a problem for many of the advanced countries. Given that inflation does not appear to be falling much further, gaining more space from interest rate cuts means we would need to reduce the impact of country risk. Global rates are low, and that helps. But South Africa borrows heavily from the rest of the world. Our current account deficit, which is equal to the foreign savings that come into South Africa, is close to 4% of GDP. Almost all our peer countries borrow less. If we try to cut rates too far, despite the country risk, investors won't have enough reason to be in South Africa. They would be better off investing in less risky places. So we need to become less risky, to enjoy more of the benefits of low global rates. Key public sector drivers of inflation, like the public sector wage bill and administered prices, could also help ease inflation. This is where fiscal and monetary policies need to be in sync. Finally, and more fundamentally, we need to appreciate the limits on what any monetary toolbox can do for growth. Let me give you the example of Italy. Italy is part of the Eurozone. Euro area inflation has been very low, and the European Central Bank has made a major effort to push it up again, with policies including negative interest rates and quantitative easing. But Italy has a large debt problem. It has problems of political and fiscal policy uncertainty. Over the past 5 years, Italy has had average growth of less than 1%. Germany, with exactly the same monetary policy, has had average growth closer to 2%. Spain, which like Italy was a major victim of the 2011-2012 euro crisis, has averaged nearly 3%. Clearly, the tailwind of easy monetary policy was not enough to overcome the headwinds of Italy's other challenges. Of course, South Africa is a different country. But what you should take away from this is that there is much more to growth than monetary policy, and it is still possible to stagnate with the loosest monetary policy imaginable. The fact of the matter is, South Africa has not made itself a high-growth country. We do not save enough to fund adequate levels of investment. We invest less than 20% of GDP to sustain strong growth. We should have investment of at least 25% of GDP. We are focused on domestic consumption as a growth driver on the grounds that it is the largest part of the economy. This effort has raised household consumption to its highest share of GDP. But we are growing more slowly than ever. We have accumulated debt faster than almost all our peer countries on the grounds that fiscal policy has to be supportive for growth. But growth stimulus works for smoothing out business cycle. It is not a long-run growth strategy. Long-run growth is about savings, investment, and exports. It is about raising productivity. We in South Africa have deliberately run down savings, focused on consumption, and pulled in imports. Our productivity growth is exceptionally low, perhaps even negative. We should therefore not be surprised that growth has stagnated. Ladies and gentlemen, let me bring this to a conclusion. We in South Africa have got to reform. It will involve some pain, but the longer we delay, the more painful it will be. We can tell ourselves comforting stories about how there are pain-free alternatives, but these narratives are misleading. We have spent a lot of time searching for easy options. These schemes don't stand up to scrutiny. Here is what we can really do about mitigating the pain of necessary reform. First, we can take the edge off with the interest rate tool, provided we have lower inflation and if country risk comes down. We can keep rates low and maybe even go lower. Second, we can devise a credible plan for making things better again. In macroeconomics, as in so many things, it is not about where you are so much as where you are going. The story of the last few years has been that South Africa is drifting into a crisis. This has been the South African story before. We have in the past been able to change that negative narrative. South Africa has many friends, and there is a lot of money out there desperate for good growth economies to invest in. We can be one of those winning countries again. We can make a difference, and this country has proved its ability to conquer adversity even in the most difficult times. Thank you very much. I, at this stage, will dethrone the lecturers and take over and direct questions to the audience to see whether you understood what I was talking about. But let's reverse the order. Let's get you to ask any questions that you might have at this stage. I have been introduced, so when you ask a question, please identify yourself and what you are studying at this good university. Oh, or if you are working here. There is a hand right here. Okay, he has the microphone, you don't, okay.
Good evening, Governor. My name is Lesetja, and I am at the business school. Governor, most economists have argued that, in fact, as far as fiscal and monetary stimulus is concerned, that we have ran the rope, that there's not more that we can do, and they are arguing for what they call structural economic reforms. Now, at the core of that, they argue that the economic reforms must change the regulatory framework for doing business in South Africa, which they go on to say that some of those would include a more flexible labor force and or maybe rather labor, let me put it like that. But at the core of labor, it speaks directly into the interest of unions. Now, some unionists and even politicians have gone on to argue that it is a neoliberal approach, the one of speaking of structural reforms, because it speaks to the interest of capital rather than the interest of the workers, or rather the working class. Therefore, my question, Governor, is it possible to reconcile the interest of the interest of labor in the form of unions, and if we are honest, some of the most vibrant and the most active and alive political parties in South Africa are more leftist orientated, except for a few ones on that side. Now, are we able to reconcile their interest with this interest of this Messiah structural reform policy? Can we be able to reconcile them? And what will it mean for the political landscape of South Africa? Thank you, Governor.
Okay. I'll take three at a time.
Evening, Governor. I'm Civilian Zimene. I'm studying an MCOM in Business Management. I have a question for you in relation to a speech you made last year and part of the speech you have today. In the speech you made titled Principled Agents, Reflections on Central Bank Independence, you listed 3 reasons why there was an attack on the central bank's independence. That was the Guptas, VBS, and the Public Protector's flawed report. Now, my question is around whether the sustained economic slump that South Africa has had could lead to a resurgence of that attack in the Reserve Bank? Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, can I ask my question?
As it pleases you, my lord.
Thank you very much, Governor, for a very concise and interesting talk. I am Michael from Maths, Stats and Actuarial Science, but I have a background in economics. But I teach all my students to question why. Before I ask my question why, I would like to qualify my question. South Africa's seen periods of pretty good economic growth over the last 20 years. However, our inequality has gotten worse. It hasn't gotten better. It's maybe stayed the same. Some people think it's worse. In 2015, the World Bank thought we were the most unequal country in the world. Now, I wonder why we are so adamant at targeting growth when we are slapped with this statistic again and again and again that we are still unequal. I understand the idea of the cake, and if the cake gets bigger, everybody's slice gets bigger, but it is very clear that in South Africa, it is the bigger slices that have been getting bigger.
Thank you very much for those questions. Balancing the interests of labor, I don't know who the other ones are. You call them messiahs of structural reforms. I don't know who the messiahs of structural reforms are. But you also threw an interesting term that the structural reforms are accused of being neoliberal. This neoliberal has sort of like become a label that we attach to anything that we seem to disagree with, especially if we are holding views that seem to be ignorant of the macroeconomic challenges that a country faces. And I don't know which department at this university teaches neoliberalism. But the point here is that everything from the budget had been accused of being neoliberal, monetary policy has been accused of being neoliberal. It's like, if you don't like something, if you call it neoliberal, hopefully people will hate it. But if anybody said something was neoliberal, and you ask them, what is neoliberalism? You will struggle to find an answer. And anyone who throws these terms, I always say, can we move on the basis of the common facts? You see, in monetary policy, we say this thing. It's okay for you to hold your own opinion. It's okay to hold your own opinion. You are entitled to your own opinion. Actually, we encourage that you must hold a different opinion, if so be it. But you are not entitled to your own facts. We must move on the basis of the same facts. And so the throwing of the labels is not very helpful. So let's put the Messiah aside. Easter is coming. And talk about the interests of labor. And when I say labor here, I am talking of employed labor. And talk about the interests of employed labor and unemployed labor. And say, who speaks on behalf of unemployed labor? And there is only one economic agent that could intervene on behalf of the unemployed. And it is the government. And thus the policies of the government have got to be reflective of the fact that we have got an unemployment problem, rather than focusing on those who are currently employed. When you say you are embarking on structural reforms, and the structural reforms, we are talking about these things and where they are captured in the National Development Plan. the National Treasury recently released a paper that distilled a few of these structural plans, reforms, but also made an attempt to quantify what would happen if those structural reforms are effected. And it is stated in that paper that if the structural reforms are effected, we would move from the current growth to growth closer to 3%. The thing about structural reforms is, when structural reforms are effected, there are losers. But unlike in other settings where you say there are losers and winners, in structural reforms, there are losers and all of us are gainers. And the way in which you manage contestation in the structural reforms is to put programs in place that will cushion the losers, so that as the reforms take place and we say there will be short-term pain and long-term we are all benefiting, that you are able to construct such a narrative. If you do not do that, structural reforms then tend to fail. But in the structural reforms, there will be contestations. There will be contestations, and the losers are not always going to be labor. There are people in business who have got entrenched interests, who, when structural reforms take place, they are going to lose. They will contest. They will lobby the politicians because they will lose when those structural reforms actually takes place. The state should be the countervailing force on behalf of the voiceless, on behalf of the poor, and structure those reforms in such a manner that they are to the benefit of society as a whole rather than narrow interest groups. Unfortunately, central banks are not particularly good at managing those contestations. We have inflation to worry about. We've got interest rate policies and reserve requirements and all of those. That's what we do. There is no contestation there. If you contest, you can contest out there, but we are shielded from that contestation. Economic slump that you called, and whether the slump could start to pose a risk to the independence. Around the world, there are questions asked about the role of central banks. And it is correct to ask that question. And part of the problem is that central banks, especially in the developed world, didn't help all of us. Because when things were tough at the height of the global financial crisis, some central bankers said central banks are the only game in town. And once you are the only game in town, you can imagine the town will come to a standstill. We are coming to watch that game. And so everybody expected central banks to do things. And central banks did do some things and helped to take the global economy out of the recession, but have not dealt with the long-term structural issues. And that's because central banks do not control those. So in any democracy, there will be questions and contestations about the institutions and their roles. There are contestations about the role of universities. There are contestations about the role of central banks. Correctly sure, there must be a contestation. There is a contestation about the role of this industry or that industry. Those things, there are question marks are raised about, oh, the people do not like the judgment passed by the court, and there will be questions about the judiciary and what it is doing. Those contestations are normal in a democratic society. The problem, the tragedy of the South African contestation is that it goes something like, please don't confuse me with your facts, because our contestation is driven by noise rather than by rational reasoning and presentation of facts. And so when you present facts, please don't bring your confusion here. we have already decided this is where we are going. And that becomes problematic in a democracy with respect to these contestations. Growth, Mike, you said you have had growth for the past 20 years. No. It fluctuated. Yes, we have had growth. We have had slumps here and there. But where we had the best growth in South Africa was between 2002 and 2007. That period, we had growth averaging around 4%. Actually, in 2 of the quarters, growth reached a high above 5%. I think the top was 5.5%. To say that during that period inequality increased is disingenuous. The highest contributor of inequality in our society is not because there are people who are earning too much and people who are earning less. It's because we have got people who are earning and people who are earning zero. So you could just see the extent of the inequality right from there. Taken to its logical conclusion is that South Africa's growth path have got to be an inclusive growth. And everybody in the world now talk about inclusive growth. And actually the World Economic Forum releases an annual report which measures inclusiveness across countries. And so for us to deal with inequality, we need to make our growth more inclusive. But you see, the subject of growth, I'm sure the professors here in the economics department will tell you, the subject of growth and how to get growth going is very complex. You can complicate it by including adjectives to growth. Pro-poor growth, job-creating growth, inclusive growth, sustainable growth, balanced growth, strong growth. So you add more adjectives to it, that means that you are not just going to be looking at the drive, you are now looking at all these other things. And I think where the space that we are in now is people talking about inclusivity. And that's because inclusivity takes account of so many other things. But at the heart of it is growth. The bottom line is, to even talk about inclusive growth, we must have growth in the first instance. If the economy is contracting, you can talk about inclusiveness. Inclusiveness in what? Because there isn't growth to talk about. So that is how I would view it. Further questions? We've taken the 3. Can I see? Can everybody who wants to talk, can you see, raise the hand so that we can see how many hands are there? Can we count them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I have 7. Okay, we'll take 4 and then take 3.
Evening, Governor. My name is Matthew Mashava, and I'm a second-year investment management and banking student. So my question to you is, what are 3 things that you love about your job that no other job in South Africa can offer you? And how do you feel about the establishment of South Africa's sovereign wealth fund?
Good evening, Governor. My name is Nelly Baba, a student at, I'm studying governance and political transformation. My question is, understanding that South Africa has a variety of political risks and threats, what would be your advice on what should South Africa do in order to attract foreign investors or foreign investment?
Hello, Governor. I'm Leo from the law school. And then there's something that I've seen there. Like, it's a certain trend. Like, wherever there's land reform, right, there are some serious economic results that are happening, right? Like, for example, it started in 2000, in the year 2000. We're still in primary school then, right? So everyone was just screaming, no, we want the land, we want the land, we want the land. And then remember there's that economic term that you said, that a crisis happens slowly and then it happens fast the last minute. Yeah, we experienced that firsthand, right? So from 2000, and then 8 years later in 2008, the government started taking the land, and then the economy, it went down, like serious. Like, so as I was saying, that what I've seen, that wherever there is land reform, there are some serious economic impact, right? Such as unemployment, poverty, and then hyperinflation. Like I still remember when that started happening, when the economy started going down, one loaf was like $50, right? And then I remember I was going to buy bread, right, in 2008, because I was there, I'm the youngest back home. And then on my way there, I got to the shop. Now the loaf was like 1,000 rands. And then I got back home and I said, Dad, the loaf is now 1,000. He said, I know you are joking. I don't know, but he said that, no, you're joking. Let's go together, because what you are saying doesn't make sense. And then by the time we got there, it was now 5 million. You see? And then by the end of that week, one loaf was like 5 billion. It even went to 100 billion. I know you know this fact that I'm talking about. But some guys, I think the 2000, if they are here, they think maybe I'm joking. So my worry, right, is that let's say, for example, you are here, yeah, obviously the land reform is happening. So my question is to prevent what happened back home, like the economy going down. Here, what is the government doing, right, to prevent the economy to collapse, or to be in intensive care unit like back home in Zim? Because all I can say is that when the economy starts going down, it's not really a nice sight. Like, for example, the reason why there are a lot of Zimbabweans us here is because we are looking for jobs, because back home there is nothing. The only way to survive in Zim, we have to be connected. So that's my worry here, that when the economy starts going down, migration is not a nice thing. To live in a foreign country, it's not a nice feeling. So what are the measures that the South African Reserve Bank implementing, or the government, to prevent the economy from collapsing or to go into the intensive care unit? Yeah, I think that's all I have to say. And by the way, I'm happy to see you live in person.
They are clapping. I missed the joke. You said you are happy. I'm what?
I said I'm happy to see you live in person. I always see you on the money return Kganyago. Yeah.
Oh! One more.
Hello, sir. My name is Tariro Monasawani, a first year in BCom Investment Management and Banking. So I wanted to ask, the South African Reserve Bank is not nationalized. And I know last year there were debates about the bank being nationalized. And a lot of large central banks in different countries, even in developed countries, have centralized. Why is it that the South African Reserve Bank is not being centralized and nationalized by the government?
Okay. Those were the four. Yeah. What are the three things I like about my job? One is that I didn't apply for it. Two is that I grew up as a young rural boy, and at a very early age, I took up the struggles of my community. Everything from access to water, to access to transport, to access to grazing land. I took those struggles at a very early age. I had always considered myself a servant of our people. And as I grew older and as I went to institutions of higher learning, I continued to take up the struggles of our people. And in the build-up to the first democratic elections, I was amongst a number of young people who were tasked with the responsibility of formulating a post-apartheid economic policy. Except that at that time I knew nothing beyond economics theory. And a decision was taken to send a number of us out of the country to go and study. And so I studied out of the country, and I worked on a number of research policy questions. And I returned, and the first job in public service was in the Reserve Bank. But I was only lasted in the Reserve Bank for 2 years and spent 15.5 years in the Treasury. So public service runs in my blood. And I can't think of any other fulfilling job than waking up every day and knowing that in my own small way, I am making a difference to the lives of our people. And that drives me. It motivates me. And I know that there are many other public servants who wake up every morning with a desire to just do the right thing, to serve our people. That drives me. It was always also pained me when I had seen good public servants being driven out of the public service using lots of other means to do those. And in this job, what I like is that constitutionally you are protected against interference from the other arms of government. And so the Constitution tasks us to act independently without fear, favor, or prejudice. So when faced with a challenge, you have got to ask yourself the question, am I still acting true to that constitutional prescript? So in 2017, after the Public Protector released her report, I did an interview with a newswire, which is represented in the room. And they asked me questions, and I talked to them about these things, and they asked me, at what stage would you resign? Because this is not what you signed for. And I said to them, resign what for? I wouldn't resign, because resigning would mean that I am not acting true to the constitutional prescripts. The Constitution said I must act without fear, favor, or prejudice. If I resign because I feel I am under threat, I am then demonstrating that I am fearing something, and that would mean that I am failing to live true to the constitutional prescripts. And that continues to drive me, because I know that I am working in an institution that is constitutionally protected. And because I work in an institution that is constitutionally protected, it forces and drives us as staff members of the Reserve Bank to always act in a manner that we preserve that institution, such that those with nefarious intentions do not have the space to say, but they have done this, you have done this, therefore you must leave. And so that is what Sovereign Wealth Fund, my friend, the Minister of Finance said he is creating it. I hope one day he visits the Free State so that he can tell us how he is going to fund it. Political risks and how to attract FDI. You know, political risks are in the area of perceptions. And I don't know, did you say you study political studies and what? Political studies. I like studies. I like the word studies, because some other people get confused and call it political science. Transformation. Yes, other people get confused and call it political science, because it is not. Because you see, the media is not short of people who call themselves political analysts and commentators. I don't know what qualifies someone to be a political, but these people comment and they are called political commentators, and they help shape perceptions and shape opinions. And so when you talk of the political risks, also political risks are shaped by what political commentary actually presents. Economists, by contrast, we would be talking about policy uncertainty. And policy uncertainty emanates from the fact that the people with political power are the people who determine policy. So when people then talk of political risk, I don't want to put this as, okay, let's put that aside. Let's talk policy. Because you see, the political leaders make policy. So let us look at the policies and evaluate the policies. And that is how you deal with this thing. So in my younger days in the National Treasury, my job was to go through all the international finance centers of the world, convincing investors to lend the South African government money. And during that period, I learned a lot about my country, because I had to explain every single policy, irrespective of where it emanated from. And so if you are to attract FDI, you have got to look at your policy settings and ask yourself whether your policy settings are investor friendly. And you said FDI. FDI most of the time looks at what domestic investment is doing. And it's also many times led by whether the locals themselves have got confidence, because they are here and they can see and they understand those policy developments. Once there is uncertainty about what is going to happen, you are going to struggle to attract investment. The president had then decided to put a team of envoys, which is a mixture of former politicians and businessmen and women, to go out there. They check the temperature, they find out what the investor concerns are, and they hopefully feed it back to the president and says, but unless you sort out the following, people are not going to invest. And that's how you would deal with that risk. My friend, land reform. Land reform has been very successful in many countries. In Japan, in Korea, it's demonstrated successful land reform. Land reform can be done, and it can lead to actually enhanced agricultural production. The point here is that it has got to be done within a legal framework that is understandable, that is underpinned by the rule of law, and is justiciable. If it is got done willy-nilly, like the way you have described, yes, it leads to significant problems. I normally would not be commenting about land reform, but here is my interest. My interest in any land reform program is what would it do to food production, and thus future food prices, and that's what that would mean for inflation, because my job is to rein in inflation. So we will constantly be looking at that and analyzing it in that respect. How you protect the economy from land reform that is not optimal and does not yield to economic results is the task of those other people who get elected every 5 years. It is their job to deal with that. Nationalization of the Reserve Bank. South African Reserve Bank is one of 6 or so central banks that still have some private shareholding. Underline that. I said they have private shareholding. They are not owned by private shareholders. They have private shareholding. South African Reserve Bank was created in 1921. Like the gentleman who asked about the Sovereign Wealth Fund and the lot, like it, the South African Reserve Bank was created by government, and after government created it, said, how are we going to fund it? They didn't have the money. So they had to go to South Africans and then issued shares and said, put money in the Reserve Bank. Actually, for a number of years after the Reserve Bank was created, the Reserve Bank didn't have enough capital. They had to build capital over a number of years, and that is the history of private shareholding in the Reserve Bank. The private shareholders in the Reserve Bank by law get paid 200,000 rands. Last year we made a profit of 4.7 billion rands. I would be surprised if we fall below that this year. The shareholders got 200,000 rands, and the rest of the money, we used a portion for our reserves, and the rest of the money was paid over to the government. So the discussion about the Reserve Bank's nationalization is a 200,000 rands debate. Okay. That said, we as the Reserve Bank, we believe that we have said everything that we had to say about this matter. We have stepped away from the debate, and we have left the political leaders to deal with it. We have made all economic arguments for it. I can tell you there isn't an economic case for it. There might be a political case. If there is a political case, we are not in that space. We are technocrats. There were 3 hands this side. There's one here in the front. You know, he took the place in the front because normally if you are in the front, you expect to be taken first, you see. So let's start with you.
Good evening, Governor. Good evening, everyone. My name is Edgar Malakwa, and I'm studying leadership communication. Governor, the government proposes to cut the public wage bill. So I want to know from you personally, do you think that is beneficial? If yes, why?
Locha.
I'm studying BSc Statistics and Economics. So my question is with regards to the Sovereign Wealth Fund. As the Reserve Bank, do you think that it's viable given our current economic situation? And should it be viable, what would be the role of the Reserve Bank in the Sovereign Wealth Fund?
Okay, evening, sir. I'm a final year BSc Stats and Economics student. What I wanted to ask you is, with the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which that will hopefully come into effect in the next decade, is the Reserve Bank, South African Reserve Bank and other Reserve Bank possibly thinking about establishing a common monetary union with other countries, at least within the SADC region, or is there currently too much political instability amongst those countries to think about establishing such a thing? Thank you.
Let's take another one. There was somebody with a microphone already. I can hear you.
Good evening, Governor. My name is Sam Kalobo. I'm studying BSc Statistics and Accounting. My question is simply, as the Reserve Bank, how do you plan to reduce spending considering the situation with ESCOM, PRAZA, and SAA?
My name is Tselo from Environmental Sciences. My question is that, do you think part of the problem with our economic crisis and societal crisis has to do with democracy and people being elected every 5 years and coming into office with short-term solutions? Thank you.
Okay, let's deal with that. Can I see a further interest in these things? I I just whispering with the professor. There are people with assignments to submit. And he warned me that some of them are trying to ask me questions that have to do with their assignments, one. And two, that there are people who like asking for the extension of the deadline, and they want to use the excuse that they were at the lecture. So I've got to cut this in the next 5 minutes. Can I see how many more hands are we still having? Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's khalas. Yes, ma'am.
Ndade kesekeme kesekeme morena dumelang. I think based on everything that you've said, when you're talking about how a lot of people, and I assume you're referring to politicians, would say a lot of populist jargon about what they want to see happening in the economy, and when you present them with facts, they don't want to entertain your facts. I'd want to reconcile that with the narrative that is trending mostly in leftist politics, which seeks to portray both Treasury and the South African Reserve Bank as institutions that want to stand against the will of the people, that is the political aspirations of the people, whether you're talking about land expropriation or you're talking about nationalizing the Reserve Bank and many other transformative frameworks. And the question that I have for you is, to what extent do you understand your role as governor, both in fact with your experience from Treasury to now being governor, as an extension of the material aspirations of society, and not necessarily as someone who's overseeing the interest of capital, and also bullying us with the lordship of the invisible hand of the market? Because every time when you're trying to talk about things that we want to achieve, free education, land expropriation, everything else, we always brought back to economic jargon that we don't understand. And it would seem that everything is just about this hand of the market that everyone is obsessed about. So to what extent do you understand that mandate of the South African Reserve Bank, but also even the role of Treasury as fulfilling that which the masses of South Africans want to accomplish? Thank you.
Good evening, Governor. My question is based on what we were discussing yesterday in the money and interest rates module. So we're basically discussing the objectives. Yeah, it's not for an assignment. I just want to know your opinion on something. So we're discussing on the objectives, the primary objectives of the South African Reserve Bank, and what could implement if maybe price stability was the primary objective of the South African Reserve Bank, because you know that currently protecting the value of the currency and the economic growth of the economy is the primary objective. So I wanted to know, in your own opinion, do you think if perhaps price stability was the primary objective, then it would improve the state of the economy currently?
Apparently, yes.
Good evening, Governor. My name is Lebohang. I'm probably an outlier in this room, as I have no background of economics whatsoever. I'm from the Department of Astrophysics.
I like that.
I have a question on what you touched based on, which is currently what has been the talk in the country, which is the technical recession that we find ourselves in. If we look at the numbers that Stats SA released, especially in the fourth quarter, many experts, which you also mentioned, that they blamed or thought that load shedding might have been the problem towards this recession. But we found that the agricultural sector has contracted by minus 7.6%, which is the highest out of the 10 other sectors. So why is that the case? Because I know most experts will say a drought may be the problem, but are there are there other problems that we are not aware of that are happening within the agricultural sector that we are not aware of, apart from drought, of course, because that has been what most experts have been hiding behind with the problems within the agricultural sector?
You said you are the Department of Astrophysics?
Yes.
Okay, so you see, if something contracts by -7, then it has actually grown by 7%, because minus multiplied by minus will give you a positive.
Testing. Okay. Right. Good evening, Governor. My name is Ahubaku Mboweni. I'm studying BSc Statistics and Economics. My question is, from a policy position, what do we need to do for us to get disinflation? Thank you.
Good evening, Governor. My name is Mandisa Skibani, originally from the BSc, but now I'm doing my honors in the BCom. In the greater scale of things, I just want to understand, as you were saying, you are here to give us facts. With the fourth industrial revolution and monetary policy, where do we stand? Because the concern is we're moving in an exponential direction. However, as a country and as with all the factors involved, unemployment, our GDP growth, where do we fit in? And what is the reality with this global world that we're trying to fit in terms of the 4IR and the South African monetary policy? Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Governor. I'm Renee Volgraaf at Bloomberg News. Governor, I mean, some of the...
You from the Communications Department?
Governor, some of the people in the audience have referred to low growth and recession, and I mean, that's also what I would like to ask about, and especially in the context of what your counterparts in the US did yesterday. They had an emergency rate cut. Is that something the Reserve Bank would look at or would consider after the news of our recession yesterday?
Okay. Those are the 7, huh? Okay. Good. Public sector wage bill and why it's a good idea to cut it. We do not express views on that. See, we are a central bank, and we are focused on inflation, so we will only be interested in the rate of change of the public sector wage bill. Is it rising faster than inflation or in line with inflation? That's where we would be commenting. But whether government wants to cut and whether it is a correct thing to do, that's the matter for government to decide, not for us. So we stay away from that. I'm sure, as you could imagine, it is a highly contested area at the moment. So it just helps us that we are shielded away from that contestation. Sovereign wealth fund viability, again, the Minister of Finance must answer that. Suffice to say that many countries that created sovereign wealth funds because they are running budget surpluses. So I will leave it there. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and whether we are looking at a common monetary union. The creation of a monetary union is like in the Euro area, is a political project. It's not a project of central banks. And the African Union summits have decided that there must be a common African currency, whatever it will be called, the Afro, whatever, but that there must be a common African currency. They set a deadline that this thing must be done by 2018. I was in the Treasury then. We warned in 2002 that 2018 is not a realistic target to achieve this. 2018 came, and the target was set to 2030, and I think there is now a new target date. And as central banks, meeting as central banks, because it is not our decision, we can only provide advice, was that if you are to have a continental monetary union, you have got to have convergence. That is what Europe had to do. So there must be a common inflation across the countries. The macro settings must be similar, so there must be a limit of what the fiscal deficits should be on the continent. There must be a limit of what the debt positions across the continent should be. There must be a limit of what the external balances should be. There must be a target set of what is an adequate level of reserves for each central bank to have. And what we established was that different regions of the continent had different convergence criteria. In SADC, we said that our target was the deficit of between 3 and 5, with a preference of it being towards 3, debt to GDP ratio of 60%. We said that reserves must cover at least 6 months cover of imports, and we also said that your current account deficit should not be more than 3% of GDP. And we found that in West Africa they had different criteria, in East Africa they had different criteria, and so forth. We met as the Association of African Central Banks, and we said, let us harmonize the targets. And we proposed those targets to the African Union, and they were supported. That is the first stage of having a monetary union. But we also know from the lessons in Europe that unless you have a fiscal union, your monetary union is not going to hold. And the fiscal union is not featuring anywhere on the agenda. And then, of course, there is the other, which is a political union, because these decisions that you are taking, there must be the political willingness to execute them. And if one of the countries does not do its bit, there must be somebody who will crack the political whip. That is the lesson from Europe. And fourth is that there must be a banking union. If the banks are operating across the continent, they can't be facing different regulations in different countries. You will have to harmonize the banking regulations. And now, why then is a fiscal union important? You see, when a bank fails, governments step in to protect the depositors. Now, there have got to be hard questions asked. If you have the Bloemfontein Commercial Bank, which has got branches in Mozambique and in Tanzania and in Botswana and in Nigeria and so forth, and the bank fails, and the depositors must be saved, whose money do you use? Do you use South African taxpayers' money? You can rest assured South African taxpayers will be on their hind legs. You can't use our money to save the depositors in Mozambique or in another country. So it is important that those things get sorted out. Unless you sort out those things, we will keep on setting new time targets for a monetary union. But what have central banks done to facilitate African integration? What we did because of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, when you trade in goods and services, at some stage these goods and services must be paid for. And what we did was to then set out a project to link the payment systems on the continent. So in Southern Africa, we have onboarded 14 out of the 15 countries on what is called the SADC Integrated Regional Settlement System, CIRES. That system enables banks in Southern Africa to clear seamlessly with each other, and to date have cleared in excess of 5 trillion rand. So the system is working. Understandably, 90% of the clearances is in rand for obvious reasons, given the size of South Africa in the region. We established that there is another system that does similar things in West Africa and one in East Africa. And then we said, let us set these systems so that they can communicate with each other, so that an importer in East Africa who buys things from Southern Africa knows they can settle. That an importer in Southern Africa who imports things from West Africa know that they can settle. That is our contribution to facilitating the integration of the continent. And that is something that we believe we can deliver during the course of this year, but in no less than 18 months that we should be able to deliver that. Democratic problems and short-termism. There is what did you say your name, ma'am, from Political Transformation? Nelly, you might have to help our colleague there. Because if you thought democracy is bad, try the alternative. And I will leave it there. In a democracy, there have got to be fixed terms. The terms must come to an end. Even the term of the governor must come to an end. But that does not make the governor to be short-term in thinking. It is the mindset of the incumbents, what they do, whether they think long-term or short-term. Price stability is enshrined in our constitution as the protection of the value of the currency. And the authors of our constitution understood that for you to have balanced and sustainable growth, you have got to have price stability. So we say price stability is a necessary condition for balanced and sustainable growth, but it is not a sufficient condition. Those things that we talked about of structural reforms, that is the stuff that you need to raise the potential growth rate of the economy and make it sustainable and balanced. So price stability is important. There are other central banks that are given responsibilities beyond price stability. Last year, we were also given additional responsibility with respect to financial stability. Even with that, there is no central bank anywhere in the world worth its salt that would ignore the issue of price stability. And so the Constitution says that we could be given other responsibilities as long as those responsibilities are captured in a national legislation and are consistent with our primary mandate. So you can't give us responsibilities that will undermine our ability to achieve our primary mandate. Such responsibilities would then be deemed to be unconstitutional. The technical recession that you talked about, my friend, and the agriculture that contracted 7%, and you would have heard in my talk when I said that when you analyze those GDP figures, and you heard people talk of stimulus and that, you would realize that we have got a serious supply problem. And the stuff that you have mentioned, that the supply side of the economy, the agriculture, we have the same thing with manufacturing, similar things with construction, all of those, we have got those problems. I had the benefit this morning of having a conversation with the Mangaung Chamber of Commerce and Industry. There was somebody from Agri SA there who talked about the constraints they had faced since the previous drought and that it would take so much time for the agricultural sector to fully recover. But he did say the current climate environment suggests that we might be having a very good crop this time around. Agriculture constitutes not a big proportion of GDP in South Africa, but it has got such powerful forward and backward linkages into the manufacturing sector, that whenever the agricultural sector recovers, you see the effects in the manufacturing sector as well. Because, you know, the agricultural sector uses inputs, it uses fertilizer, it uses tractors and equipment and all of that stuff, and it supplies food for the canning industry, for that and that and that, and that makes it so much important. What would we take to do disinflation? You have been taught well, young man, because you said disinflation and not deflation. Deflation is the other bad cousin of inflation, because that means prices are contracting. And that's really bad, because think of yourself. If you go into the shop today to buy bread, and you know we have got deflation, and the bread today is 15 rands, and you hear that, well, deflation is at some 10%, and tomorrow the bread might be down 1 rand 50. Why would you buy it today? You are going to wait and say, I will buy it tomorrow. And so it will happen with so many other things, and before we know it, people will stop producing. The baker will say, I bake the bread, and people come here, they don't buy it, they say they will buy tomorrow, and every time they want fresh bread, and then I produce the bread, I stop producing. So deflation could lead to a collapse in production. Whereas you talked about disinflation, which refers to a concerted effort to bring down inflation. That is exactly what the Reserve Bank has been doing over the past 5 years or so. And it is reflected in the fact that in 2016, inflation was at 6% and outside of our target, and we have brought it down, and we have brought it down to 4.5%, and we say we would like it to be anchored at that level. And that is the benefit of disinflation. And if you want to know the other benefit of disinflation is, the lower inflation you have, the lower interest rates you are going to have. The higher inflation you have, the higher interest rates you are going to have. And my friend from Zimbabwe there, who was referring to the rate of inflation in Zimbabwe, interest rates in Zimbabwe are in their 20s or 30s. So if you are wishing for a higher inflation, understand that you are going to face higher interest rates in the future. It's as simple as that. Fourth industrial revolution and monetary policy. The problem with fourth industrial revolution is that it gets thrown, but it has got so many components to it. And how does it affect monetary policy? Is mainly through the financial innovation channel of the fourth industrial revolution, but also the technologies that central banks can use and so forth. So I am told that these things include things called artificial intelligence and machine learning and so forth. And I got told by some big global bank that they have got a robot that they have programmed, and this robot gets fed the monetary policy statements of different central banks, and this robot is able to decode what the central bank actually is trying to say. And so that complicates things a little bit. But other banks have also written algorithms in machines that trade the foreign exchange market or trade shares and so forth. And what it means is that prices change so rapidly, but it is driven by a machine. So you are trading, and meanwhile you are trading with a machine. And so you get tired, and you also decide, okay, I'm also going to buy my own machine to trade with your machine. And then the question for central banks was, well, how are you going to keep up? Well, maybe central banks must also have their own machines to trade with the machines of the other banks. And it is called high-frequency trading. and these trades take place in milliseconds. And for that to happen, here, listen carefully, for that to happen, you need broadband. And so if your machine is located in a country with poor broadband, and thus your machine is slow, by the time your machine tries to trade with the other machine, that machine has already traded with another. So when you talk of the fourth industrial revolution, you've got to understand that you are going to have broadband and have to release spectrum to facilitate, to enable these technologies to actually take place. The fourth industrial revolution also does pose a challenge for finance, because okay, before I get to this, I have been doing this the whole day, and I'm going to do it here. How many of you have bank cards? If you have a bank card, just raise your hand. So you all have bank cards, which suggests that you have got bank accounts. Now, hands up, any of you who have visited the branch of a bank last week. 1, 2, 3, 4, but the numbers are small. Hands up who had visited the branch of the bank a month ago. The numbers are still small. That is my point. The most important gadget for you is this one. And I am sure you had gone to your bank, you had gone to sort out, your app was not working, you had been blocked or something. So of the banks that we had recently licensed, 3 of them, all of them are based on technology. Time Bank has no branches. Bank Zero has no branches. Discovery Bank has no branches. You open your account on your cell phone, you get FICAT on your cell phone, and you are set to go. And so it then raises the challenge. The banks that are having branches, if so few of you visit the branches, why should the bank keep the branch open? And so then it poses a challenge about the future of banking and how it's going to be. So all of these chaps in astrophysics and in statistics and so forth, these are the guys who are going to be taking the jobs in banking, because that is who the bankers are looking for. They are looking for people to crunch the numbers and crush the data. So that is where the finance is going. When the monetary policy, the execution, it's going to come with speed and the nature of the transmission mechanism. And some of the questions that we are asking is that at the moment in South Africa we are working on the basis that the monetary transmission mechanism is a 12 to 18 months period. So from the time you adjust the interest rates to the time it's felt in the economy, it takes 12 to 18 months. But with this fourth industrial revolution, that transmission period could actually be shortened. And so last year we ran a pilot project using some of the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. We used the blockchain technology. And with our blockchain experiment, we were able to clear all the transactions in South Africa that we clear in banking, in wholesale, in a whole day. Transactions that we clear in a whole day, we were able to clear them in 90 minutes. Now, if that is the case, it says to you that the speed at which money can be transmitted across the country could be made far more efficient. And with that, it should bring down the cost of banking and thus put money back into the pockets of banking customers. That's how we think about the fourth industrial revolution. Emergency cuts. Why not an emergency hike? Or an emergency hold? The point here is that as a central bank, we have got a number of tools that we use. We have got macroprudential tools that we use for financial stability, and we have got monetary policy tools that we use for monetary policy operations. Amongst the tools that we have are interest rates, reserve requirements, and so forth. There is one tool that we don't have in our toolbox. That tool is called panic. So, panic is not one of the tools we have. We have an MPC scheduled later this month, in the next 2 weeks really, with an announcement to be made on the 19th of March. We will assess all this information and we will make a decision based on that data. And there was no need for us to make an emergency meeting. Because, see, if you call an emergency meeting, that means that you can't call an emergency meeting and do nothing. If you call an emergency meeting, you're going to have to change rates. But you see this response from central banks globally. And in the main, it has to do with the assessment of the impact of the coronavirus. And without a doubt, the coronavirus will have significant impact on the global economy. The impact is already starting to be reflected through global supply chains, global logistics, and the impact on tourism. Financial market reactions reflect the uncertainty that is facing us. We, as the South African Reserve Bank, we are currently assessing the channels through which this will impact on the South African economy. And based on this assessment, we will take appropriate steps in accordance with our constitutional mandate to mitigate the risks that the South African economy would face. There was no need for us to, there's no need for us to panic. We would assess these things and take appropriate decisions. The last question is a question that is pretty loaded. And I had left it last because I thought that I must think very carefully about it. And I think that I've sort of like organized my thoughts. So you said that when I talked about people who say don't confess us with your facts, and I said these people are populists, you said they are politicians. No, that's not what I said. I didn't say they are politicians. You can have economists who are populists. Anyone can be a populist. The thing about populism is that you can promise anything and everything without consequence. And when you are in a position of authority and you promise anything and everything and you realize you cannot deliver it, you are putting all of us at risk the more you try to aggressively do something that is not sustainable. So, you ask the questions of my role as the governor and whether I deal with the aspirations of the population. And you asked about the Treasury. The Treasury is not here. They can answer for themselves. I can refer you to the foreword to the budget review of 2005 that I signed. And that foreword went something like, we are presenting this budget review and the budget. This budget is a monetary expression of the political program of this government. That's what treasuries do. And I can tell you, when I was in the treasury, what the treasury did every time elections came was to look at the manifestos of the political parties that are contesting the elections and attempt to quantify them and see what would that mean for the budget should any one of those political parties win the elections. And so, what always happens in government is that public servants take the manifesto of the party that had won the elections, translate it into what is called the medium-term strategic framework, and that medium-term strategic framework feeds the budget process. At least that is what was done when I was there. Things might have changed, but the Treasury can answer that question for you. Let me bring down to my role. The South African Reserve Bank is a creature of the Constitution. In the process running up to the writing of the South African Constitution, our political leaders agreed on a set of constitutional principles. Amongst those constitutional principles was a principle that said, there shall be a reserve bank, a central bank, tasked with a responsibility for price stability that shall be independent. So when the Constitution was written, and it had to go to court for certification, there were arguments made about whether the Reserve Bank has been given sufficient independence or not. And the ruling of the Constitutional Court was that the wording in the Constitution provides the central bank with the independence it needs. But it didn't end, the judgment didn't end there. The judgment went on and said, should the Reserve Bank feel that its independence is under threat, it must feel free to approach this court, meaning the Constitutional Court. So, my role as the governor of the South African Reserve Bank is to ensure that the 2,000 honest men and women of the South African Reserve Bank, who over the past 3-4 years or so had endured constant attacks on their institution for nothing other than the institution living true to its mandate, is to make sure that they stay the course, they serve the broad public interest of South Africans as tasked to them by the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. My role is nothing more, nothing less than ensuring that the South African Reserve Bank lives true to its constitutional mandate, which is enshrined in the Constitution, and understand that the Constitution is a covenant that we as South Africans entered into, and it is laying down the ground rules for all of us to regulate the contestation in society, such that the contestation in society takes place within the framework of the law. And my job as a central bank governor is not to meddle in all of those other things, but to focus on what South Africans have tasked the South African Reserve Bank with, which is to protect the value of the currency in the interest of balanced and sustainable growth in the Republic. And that is what the 2,000 men and women of the South African Reserve Bank understand and do every day when they set their foot in that institution of ours. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for this evening.
Wow, let's give him another hand. Mr. Governor, thank you from our side, and I look forward to seeing those assignments. I think they are going to be very good assignments. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you get some inspiration from this and that you get a good message, and that, Mr. Governor, also from our side, you can see the caliber of students we deliver. So thank you from our side for the wonderful visit that you made and for the wonderful speech you gave to our students. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We thought that we would leave something for the university.
Thank you very much.
So that you can tell all the others we were here.
Excellent. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, that brings to a close this evening. And do some good economics. Thank you.